August 1945. The world is celebrating the end of the bloodiest war in history. In New York City, sailors kiss strangers in Times Square, jazz floats from open windows, and neon lights flicker with the promise of peace. But just beyond the spotlight, another story is unfolding, one so strange it almost sounds impossible. German women, prisoners of war, branded as enemies, fed on years of propaganda that painted America as cruel and collapsing, are suddenly told they'll be taken, not to another camp, not to a courtroom, but into the beating heart of New York City itself. Imagine their fear, imagine their suspicion, and then imagine the shock when instead of hatred, they find shop windows overflowing with food, strangers smiling as they pass, and children laughing freely in the park. What happens when the enemy sees freedom, not through barbed wire but face to face? This is the forgotten story of German POW women who walked New York as prisoners, yet left forever changed. If this story already has you hooked, wait until you see how deep it goes. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss more hidden chapters of history. And if you think someone else would be just as shocked by this story as you are, share it with them. Trust me, this is one history lesson they won't forget. August 15th, 1945, the world erupted in joy. In New York, bells rang from steeples, factory whistles pierced the air, and sailors kissed strangers in Times Square, celebrating the war's long-awaited end with breathless abandon. Yet behind barbed wire in America's countryside, the atmosphere was nothing like Times Square. In wooden barracks, far from neon lights and cheering crowds, German women prisoners sat quietly, listening to news that felt like thunder rolling over distant mountains. For them, the war's end was not a celebration, but a question mark. Would they be freed? Would they be punished? Would America send them back to a homeland already in ruins? These women had lived lives unrecognizable from one another just a few years before. Farmers' daughters, secretaries, factory workers, ordinary people swept into the Reich's machine, now found themselves staring across fences, prisoners of a nation they had been taught to despise. Propaganda had promised them torment if captured. They expected starvation, humiliation, cruelty. Nazi radio painted America as greedy, chaotic, and merciless. Instead, they received warm food, soft bread, soap that smelled of flowers, and guards who often smiled. That dissonance was unsettling. They were supposed to see America as barbaric, yet every meal contradicted it. Every letter arriving through the Red Cross whispered of a homeland starving while they ate 3 times a day in captivity. Victory bells ringing thousands of miles away carried different meanings inside those fences. For Americans, they rang of peace. For the women, they told uncertainty, a reminder that freedom was still out of reach. Some gathered outside their barracks that August morning, staring at the horizon. The war was over, but nothing felt finished. The silence after years of bombs and sirens seemed too vast, almost frightening. A Texas-born sergeant broke the silence one afternoon, mentioning something that sounded absurd. "Some of you might see New York City." The words hovered like smoke. The women stared suspicious, certain they had misheard. New York. To them, it was a myth whispered even in Germany, a place of towers, lights, and decadence. The idea of prisoners walking freely in the enemy's capital felt impossible, almost cruel in its irony. Whispers spread through the camp like wildfire. Some thought it a trick to humiliate them. Others feared being paraded as trophies. A few dared to hope they might, for once, be treated like ordinary women. At night, lying awake on hard cots, they replayed the sergeant's words. Was it propaganda again, this time in reverse? Could it be another illusion meant to break what remained of their dignity? The barracks smelled of wood smoke and soap, but their minds wandered far. They imagined lights brighter than firestorms, shops filled with goods, children playing without fear. Each woman conjured her own impossible version of New York. Morning roll calls came and went, but tension grew. Lists were drawn up, names carefully chosen. Those who had behaved well, who seemed trustworthy, were marked for the strange journey none of them yet fully believed. A guard from Ohio tried to ease their nerves, his smile lopsided. "Don't worry, they won't bite." His words, meant as comfort, were met with silence. The women's smiles were tight, brittle, uncertain. Every detail felt surreal. They had expected punishment, perhaps vengeance. Instead, America was offering them something else, something neither paradise nor prison, an introduction to freedom itself, glimpsed not from behind barbed wire but out in the open. On the eve of departure, the women stood together, gazing at a sunset that colored the horizon. Behind them lay a homeland in ashes. Ahead, just a train ride away, lay a city pulsing with life. The distance between rubble and skyscrapers was more than geography. It was the distance between myth and reality, between propaganda and truth. And impossibly, these women, once branded enemies, were about to step across that chasm. August 15th, 1945, the world erupted in joy. In New York, bells rang from churches, factory whistles cut the air, and sailors kissed strangers in Times Square, celebrating the long-awaited surrender that ended years of fear. Behind barbed wire in America's countryside, though, the mood was entirely different. In wooden barracks surrounded by fences and watchtowers, German women prisoners sat in silence, listening to distant echoes of celebration that didn't belong to them. For these women, the war's end was not deliverance, but uncertainty. Would America send them back to a homeland in ruins, or keep them behind fences as bargaining chips for political games yet to unfold? Each prisoner carried a past reshaped by war. Some were farmers' daughters, others clerks or seamstresses. Ordinary lives swept into uniforms and service, now stranded across the Atlantic, facing a future as foreign as the land itself. Nazi propaganda had painted America as cruel, greedy, and collapsing. Captivity, they were told, meant starvation, humiliation, and torment. Instead, they received hot meals, clean clothes, and guards who sometimes nodded politely as if acknowledging their shared humanity. This quiet contradiction unsettled them deeply. Each bar of soap, each ration of bread, clashed violently with the images their leaders had drilled into them. In silence, they wondered if everything they had believed was a lie. That morning, bells rang for victory in distant cities, but inside camp the sound was carried as an omen. Freedom had come for the world, but within fences, silence was still their companion. A small group gathered outside, eyes tilted toward the horizon, as though the sky itself might reveal answers. The air was still, almost unnerving after years of bombings, sirens, and voices barking commands to take cover. Then a Texan sergeant casually mentioned something unbelievable. "Some of you may soon see New York City." The words struck like thunder. Prisoners exchanged wary glances, their suspicion hardening into disbelief. Surely it was a trick. New York was a myth, even in Germany. Stories of skyscrapers piercing the clouds, neon lights, endless energy. It had always seemed distant, almost imaginary. The thought of walking its streets as prisoners felt absurd. Whispers spread like wildfire through the camp. Some feared they would be paraded as trophies before jeering crowds. Others suspected a trap. A few cautiously dared to imagine they might walk freely, without fear or judgment. That night, cots creaked beneath restless bodies. Sleep was scarce. Some imagined endless shop windows filled with food. Others braced for humiliation. In darkness, each woman wrestled with fragile hope and the heavier weight of doubt. Day after day, tension grew. Lists were drawn. Guards announced names, selecting those considered disciplined or cooperative. Each announcement felt final, the dividing line between those who would witness the unimaginable and those left behind. One young guard from Ohio, sandy-haired and soft-spoken, tried easing their nerves. "Don't worry," he said with a grin. "They won't bite." His words earned only faint, brittle smiles, their unease heavier than his reassurance. It was surreal. Instead of punishment, America was offering them something they couldn't define. A glimpse of life outside propaganda's walls, a chance to see the enemy not as stories, but as flesh and blood. On the eve of departure, they stood outside the barracks, watching the sun sink across the horizon. Behind them lay memories of bombed cities, empty cupboards, and loved ones buried. Ahead, impossibly, waited skyscrapers and strangers. The divide between rubble and abundance, between ruin and neon, was more than geography. It was the divide between ideology and truth. And these women, enemies in name only, were about to step into that divide. When the morning whistle came and the train loomed on its tracks, silence fell heavier than words. Carrying only small belongings and endless uncertainty, the women prepared to leave captivity behind, if only for a single day. Long before they saw America with their own eyes, these women had already seen it through the lens of propaganda. Radio waves, films, and pamphlets filled their imaginations with terrifying caricatures of a collapsing enemy. The Reich insisted that the United States was a wasteland of crime and chaos. They were told streets were ruled by gangs, poverty spread unchecked, and greedy elites fattened themselves while ordinary citizens starved in misery. Even in childhood classrooms, maps were shaded to suggest America's decline. Teachers spoke of corruption, of moral decay. America was painted as both dangerous and pathetic, a nation too weak to stand without crutches. These images were repeated endlessly, hammered into daily life. Posters depicted caricatures of Americans with grotesque features, clumsy and gluttonous. Propaganda films showed smoky cities, filled with violence, where only money mattered and virtue had vanished. The strategy was simple: convince citizens that Germany's sacrifices were necessary. If America was nothing more than a greedy, chaotic place, then resisting it, even unto death, seemed like noble, righteous destiny. But propaganda thrived on distance. Few Germans had traveled to America. Fewer still could confirm or deny such stories. The farther away the truth lived, the easier it was to replace with lies. For these women, those myths were oxygen. They gave meaning to hardship, to hunger, to loss. To imagine an enemy worse off than themselves provided a strange, hollow comfort as bombs fell across their homeland. Inside camps, though, cracks began to show. Guards offered food, cigarettes, even friendly conversation. None of it matched the monstrous picture painted back home. Confusion grew quietly, though few dared to voice it aloud. Letters arriving through the Red Cross only deepened the paradox. Families described starvation, crumbling homes, and endless shortages. Meanwhile, the cruel enemy fed them 3 meals daily and provided soap that smelled of citrus and pine. The women struggled to reconcile it. Could propaganda have lied so completely? If America truly was collapsing, how could its soldiers laugh so easily, its trains run on time, its camps remain so orderly? Suspicion persisted. Many whispered that the kindness was a trap, a performance designed to manipulate them. Perhaps America was still rotten, only masking itself in a polished disguise to impress its captives. Yet the seed of doubt had already been planted. To doubt the propaganda was dangerous back home, but in captivity, behind barbed wire, no officer stood ready to silence questions growing louder in private minds. What if America was not collapsing but thriving? What if abundance was real, not faked? And if that was true, then what else about their worldview had been twisted into comfortable falsehoods? The prospect of visiting New York only sharpened this unease. To walk the streets of the very city propaganda had mocked, What could be more destabilizing than seeing with their own eyes the truth? Fear clashed with anticipation. Some prayed to find evidence confirming their indoctrination, hoping New York would reveal greed and cruelty. Others secretly wished for the opposite, that kindness and abundance might prove the propaganda hollow. Either way, stepping into New York meant something irreversible. Once they saw it, once they smelled its streets and touched its goods, they could never again fully believe the myths they had been raised on. As the train day drew closer, each woman wrestled with inner conflict. Were they prisoners of war or unwilling participants in an experiment that would shatter the illusions holding their identities together? The myths of America had been strong enough to fuel loyalty in war, but myths are fragile things. A single day in New York threatened to unravel years of lies with one undeniable glimpse of truth. In the camp, routine dulled the senses. Days blurred into weeks. Roll call, meals, chores, quiet conversations whispered under blankets. Life was confined, predictable, almost numbing. Then suddenly, one sentence shattered that fragile rhythm. A Texan sergeant, his accent thick and slow, casually told them, "Some of you will soon see New York City." His voice carried no drama, yet the words dropped like bombs. At first, silence followed. Women glanced at one another, eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight. Was it a cruel joke? An American form of mockery, dangling impossible visions before desperate captives? New York was a name heavy with myth. Even in Germany it had been whispered, skyscrapers piercing the clouds, Broadway blazing with lights, wealth spilling through streets, a land decadent, dangerous, almost unreal. The idea that prisoners, branded enemies, might walk those streets freely was inconceivable. It clashed with everything they understood about captivity, everything they had prepared themselves to endure as defeated soldiers of a fallen Reich. Whispers began immediately. Some swore it was a trap, that they would be marched through jeering crowds as examples of shame. Others feared parades of mockery, spit hurled from strangers' lips. Yet others dared imagine another possibility. Maybe the Americans truly wanted them to see their cities, to prove that abundance and order existed, to shatter the lies they had been fed since childhood. That night, bunks creaked under restless bodies. Each woman stared into darkness, rehearsing possibilities. Some imagined humiliation, others temptation, shop windows overflowing, laughter of strangers, food displayed not for survival, but for choice. The camp itself seemed suddenly smaller, its fences tighter, its routines more hollow. The promise of New York, real or not, cast shadows across every conversation. Even daily bread tasted different, flavored with anticipation. Rumors spun wild threads. Perhaps Washington wanted propaganda in reverse, to impress prisoners with America's glory. Perhaps the guards themselves weren't told the full story. Perhaps even freedom might glimmer at journey's end. A few women hardened themselves, determined not to be deceived. If this was theater, they would not play willing roles. Others secretly prayed the rumors were true, aching to glimpse something beyond wire. The guards noticed their unease. One from Ohio offered a crooked grin. "Don't worry, they won't bite." He meant kindness, but the words only deepened their suspicion. Nothing about this felt safe. The days stretched longer as lists were compiled. Officials whispered, guards compared notes, and names were chosen carefully. Only those deemed disciplined, trustworthy, or cooperative would be allowed to step beyond the fence. Every announcement was electric. A name called meant not just a journey, but an initiation into something unthinkable. Those not chosen masked disappointment behind quiet faces, though their envy burned through silence. The women studied each other differently now. Friendships carried tension. Who was judged more deserving? Who had been seen as obedient, pliant, safe? Selection was no longer abstract. It was a ticket to a myth. On the eve of departure, they stood outside the barracks, gazing westward. The sunset burned crimson, as if the horizon itself anticipated their journey. Hearts pounded with fear, suspicion, and a spark of forbidden wonder. Behind them lay ruins of their homeland, reduced to dust and ash. Ahead, impossibly, waited skyscrapers untouched by bombs. Between those two worlds stretched a chasm wider than the Atlantic, and they were about to cross it. As dawn neared, a heavy stillness settled. For once, roll call did not feel routine. Footsteps crunched, lists unfurled, and the promise of New York, unbelievable, unshakable, loomed larger than fences, guards, or propaganda ever had. The morning air carried a chill as the women gathered, clutching their meager belongings. A whistle pierced the silence. Steel wheels screeched, and a train waited like an iron beast ready to swallow them whole. Guards ushered them forward, boots crunching on gravel. Unlike before, rifles were absent, replaced with folded newspapers and coffee cups. Their casual indifference unsettled the prisoners more than guns ever had. As the train jolted into motion, faces pressed against windows. Beyond the wire lay fields stretching wide beneath the sky, too open, too vast. Freedom appeared deceptively close, yet always out of reach. They watched towns slip past, white church steeples rising against blue air. Bells rang, not air raid sirens, but Sunday rhythms. Each sound cut differently. Familiar tones twisted into something unnervingly foreign in this enemy land. The women sat quietly, gripping coats. Some whispered prayers, others fixed their gaze outward, drinking in every detail. They had been told America was savage, yet outside unfolded orderly farms and peaceful streets. Guards flipped through newspapers, sipping coffee without ceremony. This nonchalance stung more than hostility. To be watched with indifference instead of hatred was confusing. Were they truly so insignificant to the victors' daily lives? A woman from Hamburg stared at cornfields racing by. Back home, smoke still clung to rubble, and hunger gnawed at children's ribs. Here, abundance seemed endless, the earth generous, untouched by war's cruelty. Hours passed with rattling rhythm. The train became a vessel of contradictions. Captives surrounded by comforts, enemies carried gently through a landscape their leaders had called barbaric. The irony thickened with every passing mile. Conversations sparked in hushed German. Was this truly America? Was the abundance staged? Some argued the countryside might be a performance, carefully chosen. Others insisted no theater could stretch across miles of open land. The Hudson River appeared, its water shimmering like steel. As the train curved, the women leaned forward, breaths fogging glass. Beyond the banks rose shapes that seemed to pierce the heavens. Manhattan loomed. Gasps escaped lips. A jagged skyline unfurled. Towers of stone and steel stabbing upward, gleaming defiantly in morning light. At home, spires lay shattered in rubble. Here, structures soared untouched, impossibly tall, proud against the sky. One woman whispered a wordless laugh, half disbelief, half awe. Skyscrapers weren't propaganda or rumor. They were real. The image clashed violently with everything she had been told about America's supposed weakness. The train groaned into Penn Station. Doors clanged open, unleashing a roar of sound. Footsteps, shouts, loudspeakers, the thick scent of gasoline mingling with roasted peanuts and perfume. The women froze, overwhelmed by the storm of life. Escorts blended into the crowd in plain clothes. The prisoners huddled close, clinging like schoolgirls on a forbidden trip. Strangers brushed past, glancing briefly, then continuing, indifferent. The absence of hatred was almost unbearable. For years they had braced for jeers and stones, for humiliation in the streets. Instead, the greatest shock was invisibility. To be overlooked, treated as ordinary, rattled them more than open hostility ever could. Broadway waited just beyond the station's doors. Neon hummed, Cars rolled endlessly. Billboards boomed promises of musicals, cigarettes, and Coca-Cola. The women blinked, steadying themselves as though the ground itself might tilt beneath the weight of abundance. One pressed her hand against another's arm, steadying trembling fingers. The city was no myth. It was alive, electric, indifferent to their presence. Whatever this journey meant, they already knew. The world had shifted beneath them. The unknown had begun to reveal itself, not through speeches or lectures, but through the sight of a city towering beyond imagination, a place that would forever split the before and after of their lives. The train slowed, brakes screeching as it slid into the city. Breath fogged against glass as women leaned forward, eyes wide, watching towers loom closer with every rattling second, each heartbeat pounding louder than the wheels. Manhattan rose like a crown of steel, sunlight striking glass and stone until the skyline seemed alive. For women from bombed-out Hamburg or Cologne, the sight was overwhelming, almost cruel in its perfection. No rubble scarred these streets. No hollow shells of buildings wept smoke into the sky. Instead, skyscrapers climbed endlessly upward, proud, untouched, as though war itself had never dared to cross the ocean. One woman whispered, "Himmel!" the words slipping out, unguarded. Another pressed trembling fingers to the window, half expecting the towers to dissolve into illusion. Yet they were solid, defiant, glowing with morning's fire. At home, church spires had collapsed into ruins, reduced to charred bones of stone. Here, towers pierced clouds in arrogant defiance, as if mocking every propaganda tale of a nation crumbling beneath chaos. The train plunged into Penn Station's vast cavern. Darkness, then light exploded again as doors clanged open. Noise swallowed them whole, shouts, footsteps, echoes from loudspeakers. The women clutched coats, overwhelmed by a tide of humanity. Smells collided in the air: gasoline, roasted peanuts, perfume, coffee. It was dizzying, alien, yet intoxicating. Every detail screamed life, movement, abundance, so different from the gray silence of camps or the charred ruins of Germany. They stepped down onto the platform, herded gently, but without barking orders. The absence of shouted commands disarmed them. Even under watchful eyes, they were treated more as passengers than prisoners, more as women than enemies. Crowds swirled, indifferent. Some Americans glanced curiously, most hurried on without interest. To be ignored cut deeper than they expected. Indifference stripped them of both menace and significance, leaving them uncomfortably human among millions. The streets above struck like lightning. Broadway roared with energy, horns blaring, vendors shouting, neon signs blazing even in daylight. Colors screamed from billboards promising cigarettes, musicals, and soda, a carnival painted onto the canvas of stone. One woman staggered slightly, steadying herself against a companion's sleeve. The noise, the colors, the pace, it was sensory assault. For years they had known silence broken only by bombs. This was a storm of life. They passed Macy's towering facade, windows glittering with silk dresses, polished shoes, and mountains of canned goods arranged like sculptures. One prisoner stopped, pressing her palm to the glass, eyes narrowing, unable to believe it was real. Back home, heirlooms had been traded for potatoes. Children had scavenged in rubble for crumbs. Here, food was decoration. Fashion spilled endlessly, and luxury gleamed where survival alone defined their memories of recent years. A guard noticed their hesitation and bought roasted chestnuts from a vendor. The women accepted cautiously, fingers trembling as they peeled the shells. The taste was warm, sweet, almost childlike, an edible memory of a world they thought lost. They walked further, passing newsstands stacked with papers, shoe-shine boys polishing boots, vendors hawking roasted peanuts. Everywhere the rhythm was commerce, not survival. Every detail screamed a prosperity impossible to reconcile with their shattered homeland. One woman lifted her chin, forcing composure, but her eyes betrayed tears. The sight of abundance cut deeply. To see children laughing, women shopping freely, men carrying bags of fruit, it was almost unbearable. For years, propaganda had promised America's collapse. Yet here it stood, taller, brighter, louder than anything they had imagined. Each step into Manhattan dismantled another brick of the myths that had once held them captive. In that first glimpse of the skyline, they realized something profound. The war had not simply been lost on battlefields. It had been lost in perception, shattered by a single city that refused to crumble. The women emerged from Penn Station into a world unlike any they had ever known. Broadway stretched before them, alive with neon, noise, and motion, as if the entire city pulsed like a heartbeat. Traffic roared, horns blared, and streetcars rattled along tracks. Vendors shouted in accents sharp and musical, hawking roasted peanuts and papers. The rhythm of New York was relentless, overwhelming every sense in waves. For years, silence had been broken only by air raid sirens. Now laughter echoed from sidewalks, music spilled from shop windows, and the endless roar of automobiles filled the air with strange mechanical music. They passed towering billboards for Coca-Cola and Lucky Strike, faces of smiling dancers beaming down from painted posters. To women who had traded ration cards for scraps, such displays looked like impossible theater. Shop windows glittered with silks and feathers, polished shoes, gleaming hats. Mannequins wore dresses so luxurious they seemed unreal. Food itself became spectacle, mountains of fruit, towers of chocolates, goods arranged not for survival, but for allure. One woman pressed her forehead against the glass, eyes narrowing as if to test whether it was real. At home, she had given away a ring for bread. Here, chocolate overflowed in pyramids. Guards guided them carefully, weaving through the throng. The prisoners clung to one another, their coats buttoned tightly despite the warmth. Every glance from strangers carried weight, though most New Yorkers brushed past without care. The absence of hostility unsettled them most. They had braced for mockery, prepared for hatred. Instead, they found indifference. To be unnoticed in the heart of the enemy felt stranger than open scorn. At a corner, a vendor handed them roasted chestnuts. Fingers shook as they peeled shells, the nutty sweetness carrying them back to childhood winters before bombs and hunger. For a moment, laughter cracked the silence. The further they walked, the sharper the contrasts grew. In Germany, children scavenged ruins, cheeks hollow. Here, boys darted across streets chasing balls, their mothers laughing nearby, unburdened by fear or rubble. One woman stopped suddenly at the sight of oranges stacked like suns in a wooden crate. A vendor, catching her stare, pressed one into her hand. She inhaled deeply, whispering, "I had forgotten this smell." The small kindness struck deeper than speeches. Propaganda had promised cruelty. Instead, a stranger gave her fruit without hesitation. The gesture, ordinary to Americans, shattered illusions more effectively than any lecture on democracy ever could. Broadway became a living textbook, each step a contradiction of Nazi myths. Policemen directed traffic with whistles, not guns. Shopkeepers tipped hats politely. A little girl giggled at their heavy coats, no fear in her eyes. They paused in Central Park where children sailed toy boats, trees swayed, pigeons scattered, lovers strolled without urgency. One prisoner turned her face away, hiding tears. Her son in Bremen had never lived to see peace. The abundance was not numbers on a page, but a sensory flood. Hamburgers sizzling in diners, ice cream dripping down children's fingers, jazz spilling from open windows, all proof of a world untouched by devastation. They laughed nervously, passing American women in silk stockings. Back home, lines painted down legs had mimicked seams when fabric vanished. The absurd comparison, painted illusions versus real silk, stung with both bitterness and reluctant amusement. Doubt remained for some. Could this be staged? Could Washington orchestrate such a performance? Yet the sheer sprawl of it, the millions of faces, endless lights, unmanufactured noise, was too vast for illusion. It was life itself. Broadway, with its neon glow and chaotic hum, had dismantled years of certainty. Every step along that avenue drove cracks deeper into the myths they carried, leaving them to wonder what truths lay waiting ahead. On Broadway's sidewalks, the women found themselves face to face with ordinary Americans. No guards shouting, no crowds jeering, just strangers passing by, indifferent, curious, or kind in ways they never could have imagined.